What really happened that night in Harlem? Philthy Rich claims it was a moment that could have ended everything he was building, left alone, surrounded by danger, with all his chains on, while one of hip-hop's biggest names walked away. That's right, Jim Jones allegedly left Philthy Rich stranded in the heart of Harlem, a place where reputation and survival are everything. But it doesn't end there. In the middle of that tension, whispers began about an offer from Birdman, the mogul behind Cash Money Records, who reportedly wanted to sign Philthy Rich. Imagine being torn between being left in a potentially dangerous situation and suddenly being offered a deal that could change your entire career. This is not just another story about rap beef or fame. It's a raw glimpse into the streets, the music industry, and the high-stakes decisions that artists like Philthy Rich face every day. Fans online are divided. Some call it betrayal, others see it as a test of resilience. And while we don't have every detail verified, the impact on Philthy Rich's life, career, and mindset is undeniable. In this video, we break down the night in Harlem, the claims about Jim Jones, Birdman's shocking offer, and the personal drama that unfolded behind the scenes, a story of trust, power, and survival in the unforgiving world of hip-hop. The streets of Harlem are not forgiving, and Philthy Rich learned that the hard way. One night, a simple meeting turned into a scene that could have ended careers and changed lives. What started as a routine stop quickly escalated into tension, so thick you could feel it in the air. He was left standing alone, every chain around his neck glinting under the streetlights, surrounded by shadows that whispered danger. Jim Jones, someone he had trusted to guide him through the city's network, walked away. The feeling of betrayal wasn't immediate. It came in waves, creeping like ice through his veins as he realized just how alone he really was. Every step he had taken in his career, every risk he had calculated, suddenly felt insignificant in that moment. Harlem had a way of testing those who tried to rise above the noise, and that night, the streets were testing him in the most brutal way imaginable. As Philthy Rich waited, tension building with each passing second, he remembered the offers, the promises, and the deals that had always seemed just out of reach. That's when whispers of Birdman's interest reached him. The mogul behind Cash Money Records, someone who had signed legends, was apparently interested in him. But the timing couldn't have been stranger. A potential career-defining deal dangling just as he was left exposed on the streets. Every detail was amplified. The cold wind biting at him, the sound of distant sirens, the occasional shout echoing between brick walls, all of it became part of the story he lived in real time. Philthy Rich was forced to confront the weight of trust and the cost of ambition simultaneously. He thought about his chains, heavy and symbolic, representing success, wealth, and the power he had fought for. But in that moment, they became almost a liability, a visible target for anyone who might think he was vulnerable. Every glint reflected the harsh reality. Appearances mean something in Harlem, and being alone meant everything. Birdman's name lingered in his mind, both a hope and a challenge. The offer was real, and if it materialized, it could change his trajectory forever. But he couldn't focus on that yet. First, he had to survive the immediate tension, navigate the city's harsh gaze, and process the sense of abandonment that lingered after Jim Jones left. Harlem has a rhythm of its own, a pulse that dictates respect, trust, and caution. Philthy Rich learned quickly that night that loyalty isn't given, it's earned, and it can vanish in an instant. He moved carefully, every step calculated, blending awareness with caution, knowing that one wrong move could escalate the already tense situation. The night stretched long and time slowed. Each second was filled with the potential for confrontation. But it wasn't just physical danger that weighed on him. It was mental, emotional, the realization that even in a world where you climb every ladder and make every connection, one misstep or one betrayal could leave you exposed in ways you hadn't anticipated. He thought about every moment that had led him there. The people he had trusted, the streets he had navigated, the opportunities he had fought for, all culminating in this moment where everything could either make him stronger or break him completely. It was a lesson written in real life, raw and unfiltered, without the polish of the stage or the comfort of fame. Birdman's offer, when he finally got the chance to process it, carried a different weight. It was more than just a deal, it was validation. It was recognition from someone who had seen the struggles, understood the hustle, and had the power to elevate him beyond the chaos he was currently facing. But offers don't erase betrayal, and validation doesn't fill the gap left by trust broken. The streets of Harlem didn't forgive mistakes, and they didn't reward naivety. Philthy Rich had to navigate both, balancing ambition with caution, awareness with patience. That night, every decision mattered. Every glance, every step, every reaction carried significance beyond what anyone outside could understand. By the time the night faded toward dawn, Philthy Rich had processed what had happened and what was possible. He understood that the streets, the chains, the deals, and the betrayals were all intertwined. Each element shaped who he was and who he would become. The experience was brutal, but it was also defining. He walked away that night not just as a man left in Harlem with chains on, but as someone who had survived, observed, and learned. The city had tested him, the people had challenged him, and yet he emerged with a clearer understanding of power, respect, and opportunity. The story wasn't over, but the night had marked him in ways that only those who truly navigate the streets and the industry could comprehend. By the time dawn began to creep over Harlem, Philthy Rich felt the weight of the night still pressing down on him. The chains around his neck, once symbols of pride, now reminded him of the vulnerability he had faced, how easily trust could be broken, and how thin the line between opportunity and danger really was. But along with that vulnerability came a sense of clarity. He realized that every experience, every risk, every betrayal was a lesson that could shape not just survival, but legacy. Birdman's offer loomed in his mind. It was not just a deal. It was a door to a world he had dreamed about but had barely touched. Cash Money Records was legendary, its history intertwined with some of the biggest names in hip-hop. Being noticed by someone of that magnitude was validation that his talent, hustle, and persistence were impossible to ignore. Yet, the timing could not have been more ironic. An opportunity presented just as one of his own mentors, Jim Jones, had left him exposed in the streets. The contrast was almost poetic, the world offering a path upward while the streets reminded him of the stakes that came with visibility. He thought back to the moments leading up to the incident. The casual conversation, the nods of respect, the laughter that had preceded tension. How quickly the energy shifted, how the smiles faded into an atmosphere thick with suspicion. Harlem had its rules, and one could never assume that past relationships guaranteed present safety. Philthy Rich realized that in a world governed by perception, even the smallest misstep could be magnified, making the difference between dominance and downfall. The streets weren't just a backdrop, they were active participants in the drama. Every figure watching, every corner observed, every whisper carried weight. By being left alone that night, Philthy Rich had been reminded of a truth few wanted to acknowledge. Respect must be constantly maintained, and loyalty can evaporate in an instant. He had learned to read the energy, to anticipate reactions before they surfaced, and to understand that survival often demanded patience over confrontation. Yet, the allure of Birdman's offer could not be ignored. The mogul had seen potential in him, a spark that could be molded into mainstream success. The offer was a test as much as an opportunity, a question of whether Philthy Rich was ready to navigate the industry at a level where every decision carried financial, professional, and personal consequences. Accepting meant entering a system with established hierarchies, one where missteps could be costly, but success could cement his name in hip-hop history. Philthy Rich weighed the options carefully. Accepting the deal might have given him access to resources, connections, and exposure beyond Harlem. But it also meant navigating politics, maintaining credibility in the streets, and ensuring that every move reflected both ambition and integrity. Rejecting the offer, on the other hand, might have preserved street respect, but delayed the trajectory he had been building for years. The choice was not just strategic, it was personal. As he walked through the quiet streets, the sun beginning to warm the brick facades, he thought about survival and legacy simultaneously. The night had tested him, but it also sharpened his instincts. Birdman's interest was validation, yes, but it was also a reminder that the industry moved at a pace different from the streets, demanding foresight, patience, and careful calculation. Every meeting, every handshake, every word could tip the balance between progress and setback. The contrast between Jim Jones' betrayal and Birdman's opportunity weighed heavily on him. One had reminded him of the fragility of trust, the other had illuminated the possibilities of ambition. Both experiences, however different in tone, were interlinked. They underscored the constant negotiation between street credibility and professional advancement. Philthy Rich understood that the streets would continue to judge, to scrutinize, and to test him, but he also knew that the music industry offered a broader arena in which he could assert influence and reshape perception. He paused near a familiar corner, the echo of the night still lingering, reflecting on the resilience required to navigate both worlds. Street survival demanded vigilance, awareness, and adaptability. Music industry survival demanded vision, negotiation, and timing. The real challenge was balancing both without compromising authenticity, a task far easier said than done. Philthy Rich knew that every decision would be dissected, every association examined, and every opportunity scrutinized. Yet, the weight of responsibility was also a measure of the power he could wield. That night in Harlem, alone yet acutely aware of the layers surrounding him, became a defining chapter in his journey. The chains he wore symbolized more than wealth. They symbolized endurance, visibility, and accountability. They were a reminder that prominence came with risk and that the higher he climbed, the more intricate the path became. Each glint of metal reflected lessons learned, the unpredictability of human behavior, the subtle cues of loyalty, and the stakes that came with ambition. When the offer from Birdman became real, Philthy Rich knew the narrative was shifting. It was no longer just about survival in a single night. It was about positioning for a future where every move could reverberate through streets and stages alike. The decision required clarity of mind, understanding of context, and foresight beyond immediate emotional reactions. It was a balancing act between ambition and authenticity, opportunity and perception. By the time the city fully woke, the night's intensity had transformed into purpose. Philthy Rich emerged not merely as a man who had been left in Harlem with chains on, but as someone who had confronted the fragility of trust, recognized the significance of opportunity, and internalized the stakes of every decision in a life divided between street credibility and industry ambition. Each lesson, each reflection, each choice was a step toward consolidating influence, turning challenges into leverage, tension into clarity, and risk into strategic advantage. By the time the first week after that night had passed, Philthy Rich was already thinking several moves ahead. The weight of what had happened in Harlem hadn't fully lifted, but he knew that dwelling on it wouldn't solve anything. In the streets, hesitation was weakness, and in the industry, delay could cost millions. He had been left alone, exposed, with all his chains on, but now he had a choice. Let that night define him, or use it as a turning point. The offer from Birdman lingered like a promise and a challenge simultaneously. It wasn't just about signing to a major label, it was a recognition that someone at the top saw his talent, his hustle, and his potential to transcend the streets that had shaped him. The decision required careful calculation. Accepting could elevate him beyond Harlem and even beyond regional influence, but it also meant navigating a system that demanded savvy and resilience. Rejection could preserve his street credibility, but it might slow the momentum he had built over years of relentless grind. Philthy Rich knew that in moments like these, strategy was everything. He reached out to trusted advisors, people who had seen the industry from both angles, who understood how to balance street perception with professional opportunity. He wanted to make sure that if he stepped into Birdman's world, he would do so on his own terms, not as someone pushed by circumstance, but as someone commanding respect. Meanwhile, the streets hadn't been forgotten. News of Jim Jones leaving him in Harlem spread quickly, sparking conversations in neighborhoods and among peers. Some saw it as a betrayal. others as a test of character. Filthy Rich recognized the importance of maintaining his reputation. In the world he navigated, perception often mattered as much as reality. A single misstep could shift alliances, provoke conflicts, or create unnecessary tension. He had to tread carefully, blending assertiveness with diplomacy. The days following were a delicate dance. He maintained his presence in Harlem, showing strength and confidence, but never flaunting vulnerability. Every interaction, every handshake, every appearance was measured. At the same time, he was preparing for meetings with Birdman, refining his pitch, demonstrating not just talent, but clarity of vision. This dual focus, managing street perception while pursuing industry opportunity, was exhausting, but it was necessary. During meetings with Birdman, Filthy Rich realized that this deal was bigger than money or fame. It was about positioning, being seen as someone who could bridge the worlds of street credibility and mainstream success. Birdman didn't just want an artist. He wanted a figure who could hold influence in multiple spheres. Filthy Rich understood immediately. This was about legacy, not just a record contract. Yet, even as he navigated these high-stakes meetings, the memory of Harlem lingered. He remembered the tension, the isolation, the unspoken lessons of trust and betrayal. Every chain, every glint, every shadow from that night was a reminder that prominence came with exposure, and exposure required vigilance. Filthy Rich internalized these lessons, knowing that surviving in the industry demanded not just talent, but awareness, strategy, and the ability to make rapid, calculated decisions. By midweek, Filthy Rich began seeing the fruits of this careful approach. Discussions with Birdman progressed, and he could feel the balance shifting. The mogul recognized not just the music, but the mind behind it, the ability to navigate both streets and studios, to command respect from peers and industry giants alike. For Filthy Rich, this acknowledgement validated his journey, the long nights, the struggles, the risks he had taken in Harlem and beyond. But the streets remained a constant reality check. Even as deals moved forward, Filthy Rich continued to maintain visibility and authority in neighborhoods that mattered to him. He knew that credibility could be lost overnight if perceived as abandoning the streets or succumbing too quickly to corporate influence. Every handshake, every public appearance, every interaction was scrutinized, and he had to ensure that his rise didn't alienate the people who had supported him from the beginning. Tension and opportunity intertwined in a way that tested both patience and judgment. Filthy Rich found himself constantly assessing which moves would strengthen alliances, which statements or actions could be misinterpreted, and how to balance ambition with authenticity. Each decision had ripple effects. One wrong choice could undo years of effort. But each right move could solidify a foundation for long-term influence, both in Harlem and beyond. By the end of the week, a sense of control began to emerge. The initial shock of being left alone faded, replaced by strategic clarity. Filthy Rich had transformed the night's tension into actionable insight. He understood that survival was only part of the equation. Growth required leveraging every experience, converting challenges into opportunity. The Harlem incident, once a moment of vulnerability, became a defining chapter in his journey, a reminder that he could withstand pressure and emerge stronger. Finally, the deal with Birdman reached a point where it could be executed. Filthy Rich entered the meeting not as someone desperate for validation, but as a figure aware of his worth, his vision, and his potential. He negotiated from a place of understanding, balancing ambition with integrity, and ensuring that his trajectory remained aligned with both street respect and industry strategy. By the time Filthy Rich walked out of that meeting, a transformation had occurred. The chains he had worn as symbols of vulnerability and survival now represented resilience and readiness. He had faced betrayal, tension, and high-stakes opportunity simultaneously, and emerged with authority over both worlds. Harlem had tested him, Jim Jones had challenged him, and Birdman had offered a gateway. Filthy Rich had turned it all into leverage. That moment marked not just a career milestone, but a personal evolution. He understood that true power came not from fame or money alone, but from the ability to navigate the intersections of influence, loyalty, and opportunity. Harlem had almost broken him, but it hadn't. Birdman had offered a path upward, and Philthy Rich was ready, not just to walk it, but to own it. By the time the city fully stirred to life, Philthy Rich had transformed the narrative. From chains in Harlem to a potential empire in the music industry, he had shown that strategy, patience, and resilience could turn even betrayal and tension into a defining story. The night that could have been a downfall had instead become a catalyst, setting the stage for the next chapter of his rise.